Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales, and to part 3 of our look at the Viking ships. So, let us continue on that theme, the Viking ships. Seen usually in the popular mind as the dragon-headed bringers of terror, pillage and death, with a good bit of rape thrown in as well, just sort of a bit of entertainment on the side. But that is a very stereotypical view, constantly reinforced by movies and TV shows, and not always very accurate documentaries. I've seen some documentaries on YouTube, for example, that fall rather short from the historical accuracy point of view. Just like the idea that Vikings hated Christianity, a theme that often comes up, and they destroyed churches and monastic institutions to try and wipe the new faith from the map, get rid of it altogether, drive Christianity away. No, actually, they really didn't give two hoots what other people believed in, just as long as those other people didn't try to make them believe the same thing by force, The wealth of the day was often to be found in churches. Many bishops were far wealthier than the thanes and kings they served, and of course that is why the Vikings raided churches and monasteries. They were filled with all kinds of wealth, and they were guarded, if you could call it being guarded, by people who would just pray at any attackers, making them very soft, easy targets. "Bless you, my son, and please do not rob us." Making a rather poor defensive strategy. In part 2, we looked at the various types of Norse ships. And this time, we shall be looking at how they were actually built, among other things. The Norse became expert shipbuilders, using a method known as clinker, in which the bottom edge of a hull plank overlapped and was riveted to the top of the plank below it, working upwards. So it gave the ship a sort of stepped look. You didn't see the smooth side to a ship like you would associate with ships today. Iron rivets and washers being used to secure the planks. These rivets placed about 20 inches apart. And this was to allow a slight give in the wood, as well as another brilliant design feature, which I'll come to in a moment, making the hull flexible enough that it would ride up on the waves rather than simply crashing through them as other ships did, and thus absorbing the full force of a rough sea, which the Viking ships did not, enabling the longships to ride out the often mountainous waves of the North Sea and the North Atlantic far better than other types of ships, which is all the more remarkable when you think of how low the freeboard was on a typical longship. I mean, you could lean over the side and put your hand into the water. There wasn't really very much between you and the sea, unlike most other medieval ships that were very high-sided and continued to be for centuries afterwards, probably as a protection against pirates, the later ships being far more difficult to board than were most of the Viking ships with their extremely low freeboard. Only the cargo-carrying Knorrs were high-sided. Not all Norse ships, despite their superb construction, survived the extreme sea conditions, of course, as when Eric the Red assembled a large fleet to take settlers to the newly discovered Greenland, and 11 of the 25 ships that started out were lost when the North Atlantic turned unusually rough, though losses on that scale would have been actually very, very rare. And it's possible that some of those ships were old or in poor condition. In fact, that is quite likely the reason for the high losses, that people were using old ships and they hadn't been properly looked after. Now, once the clinkered hull was finished, the planking would have been sealed with a mixture of animal hair and moss, coated in tar, and pine resin would have been used as a sort of varnish to seal the planks from weathering and sea creatures that might attach themselves to the hull. There is evidence that ships were actually painted in very bright colours, also helping to preserve the timbers, and they would certainly have probably looked quite nice. And when not in use for long periods, they would be beached. taken out of the sea to prevent damage from salt water, as well as allowing inspection of the hull below the waterline and any resealing of the timbers that might be required, or scraping off barnacles and things that had attached themselves to the hull. Now, this method of shipbuilding, it wasn't exactly what you'd call cheap. No, you didn't get quality like that in the bargain basement, since apart from the quantity of timber required, 11 large oak trees were required for an average-sized longship. And just the keel of the famous Gokstad ship required a straight oak tree 80 feet long. But intense labor was required to produce ships. A considerable quantity of iron was also needed for the many hundreds of rivets required. Approximately 330 pounds of iron required just to rivet one ship. And iron was a very valuable commodity. Now, today, we might not regard iron as very special. It's gone out of fashion. Iron, iron would be regarded as a very, very, cheap thing. But 1,000 years ago, it was extremely valuable. You couldn't just walk out and find it lying around on the ground all over the place and pick it up. There was like bog iron and that, but, even that was quite hard to locate. And it was a vital part of everyday life, not just shipbuilding. Tools, weapons, cooking equipment, implements of all kinds required it. So only those people who were reasonably well off were going to be building themselves a ship. Poor people did not own big ships. Small boat, perhaps, yeah, maybe. Ships, no. That was also the reason that the idea of every Viking fully armoured in chainmail, wearing a helmet and carrying a sword or purpose-made battle axe is completely wrong. Most men never wore chainmail. It was very time-consuming to make, and it was expensive. So unless he took it off a dead adversary, a farmer or a fisherman going on a raid, well, he wouldn't have it. He'd be wearing his own clothes for the most part. Few men wore helmets, and for the same reason. And swords were extremely expensive, and generally they were the prerogative of the most important warriors. The jarls and kings had them, and their own personal household troops, of course, the housecarls, who were professional soldiers and fully equipped because their employers could afford it. Most ordinary men would have carried just a spear, a large hunting knife, an axe, and an axe that would be the one probably they used for woodworking or general farming and household tasks, rather than the specially made and expensive battle axes. And some would have had farming or fishing tools like slash hooks, fish spears, and the like, and bows that they would have used for hunting. Shields, too, would not have been available to everyone, though just as with armour, helmets, or swords, of course, they could be acquired from dead enemies, and many men probably did equip themselves in that manner. The more often they went raiding, the more chance they had to better their equipment. So the most experienced men who would have raided frequently would have been the best armed and equipped. Logic would certainly seem to dictate that. Now, trees were not cut with saws. They were radially split along their length with wedges, using mallets and axes, making them far superior for shipbuilding than saw-cut planks, since they were split following the grain. And that made them less likely to suffer from warping, splitting, or shrinking, giving them much greater strength. And many specially shaped parts would be cut from sections of trees that were a similar shape to the shape that you required. You wouldn't just stick bits together. You needed a curved piece, so you cut it from a curved part of a tree. You needed an L-shaped piece, so you cut a section of trunk with a suitable branch sticking out from it. You wanted a T-shaped piece for your ship. Well, that could be obtained from a section of trunk with branches to either side. Rather than taking this thing and nailing that on there and nailing a bit here, you had the one piece of solid wood, obviously having much, much greater strength than cutting everything from straight wood and maybe sticking it together. But just selecting all the wood took a considerable time. Going around, that piece will do there. Oh, yeah, and there's a bit we need for that. And that piece will do for, that would have taken a very, very considerable time, let alone cutting the stuff and finishing it. King Olaf Tryggvason's ship, the Long Serpent, took an entire winter to complete, with a large workforce under a master shipbuilder. The VIKINGs television show, hardly a great example of superb historical accuracy, it must be said. That show gave the impression that Floki could whack a ship together in a few days, all by himself. You want a ship for next week, Ragnar? No problem. No, he couldn't really have done that. And of course, Ragnar was prepared to wait a few years for it. King Olaf's ship, taking months to construct, with a force of general labourers, tree fellers, plank cutters, and stemsmiths, as they were called, all working under the master shipbuilder, and using a sophisticated set of tools that we might not think of today as being in use over 1,000 years ago, including a large adze, wooden mallets, various wedges, long bow saws, and a variety of other specialist saws, broad-bladed and other types of axes, steel files, gouges, anvils, chisels, assorted knives, and twisting drill bits. They were very, very well equipped with quite sophisticated equipment. Most early ships were made of oak, though in later years, as oak trees became scarcer, being used for other construction purposes, of course, other than shipbuilding, pine was used quite a bit as well. The Norse shipbuilders had some very advanced skills and techniques, one of them being the keelson. Now, that was a large section of wood that straddled the keel but wasn't actually attached to it, being fastened to multiple points along the inside of the hull. And above the keelson was a humpbacked piece of wood with a slot in it, the mastfish, as it was known, due to its fish-like shape. And you can see it quite well represented in good detail in this little model here. You can see the little humped thing there. And there was a slit, and the mast could be slid into this slot without having to lift it into place, and a large wedge was then driven in to hold the mast in place. And the wedge also is accurately represented in the model. You can see it at the back of the mastfish there. The mast could be anything up to 40 feet high, and it carried a sail of 900 square feet on average. Now, that's obviously very heavy, so sliding it into place reduced the work considerably, rather than having to take it and drop it down into a hole of some kind. And to take it down, the wedge would be knocked out, the mast would be slid back out again and laid down. Then it would be lifted up onto two T-shaped cradles, and they would have been mounted fore and aft, and the sail would also be stored on the same cradle, so not shown on the model, of course. Now, the sail. The sail was made of wool, and it had to be woven by the women. Woven on the same vertical looms used to make clothing, and that was quite a big job, literally, in this case. The Viking Ship Museum at Roskilde made a typical Viking sail as an experiment, which required the wool from 200 sheep, and when dry, the sail weighed 198 pounds. Now, it took 7,850 hours of weaving by a considerable number of people, which would be roughly 4.5 years' work for just one person. Another reason why Floki couldn't have produced all those lovely ships in Vikings. Who was weaving the sails for him? His wife? Whoa! Now, if she could weave sails at that speed, wow! All the women in the village would probably have worked on a sail, each weaving a strip. The strips were then sewn together. The finished sail was treated as it would have been in the Viking times during this experiment. To make sure it repelled water and that it was windproof, which obviously was necessary if it was to work properly catching the wind, it was treated with raw ochre and a mixture of horsemane fat and water in the ratio of 1:10. Now, this lovely concoction was boiled, cooled down, and then hand-rubbed into the sail using glass stones. It was the ochre that made the sail tight, After a time, beef suet was kneaded into the front to make the surface smooth. Natural oils would also have been added. Now, all that was quite a job. And sails were naturally treated very, very carefully. You couldn't just come home and ask your wife if she'd just run you up another sail for next week because you just dropped yours overboard. I think that would have been grounds for divorce in Old Norse times. Sails may have been coloured in stripes. There is evidence for that, as on our little model. There's quite a bit of evidence for that, and probably from various women weaving them in reasonably narrow strips, the width of their looms, and using different coloured wool, the various strips being sewn together, and a combination of colours could then be chosen as required. Well, you make blue strips, and you make red strips, and so forth. Now, the keelson and the mastfish together, attached as they were to various strong points on the ship rather than just resting down on the keel, this spread the great weight of the mast and the sail evenly onto the hull, keeping it off the keel and reducing the strain on the vessel's structure, and preventing any risk of a collapse amidships, especially with a very strong wind filling the sail, which would have put considerable pressure onto the mast's mounting. And longships were very lightly constructed. I mean, the planking on the Gokstad ship, for example, was only 1 inch thick, so you wanted to keep as much stress off the main frame as possible. And the mastfish and the keelson, of course, did that quite splendidly. The other brilliant design feature I mentioned earlier, well, not just the flexibility of the hulls, preventing them snapping in rough seas, but their shape, the way they were curved, along with their clinker construction, which modern experts discovered created bubbles. Now, bubbles along the edge of the planking as it moved through the water, giving the ship a cushion of air underneath it, reducing resistance in the water, and giving these ships the ability to sort of ride on the water rather than ploughing straight through it. They almost glided over it. If you see a modern reproduction of a Viking ship, especially in rough seas, you'll notice how it almost rides up over the waves. And that is due to the shape of the hull and the air bubbles and all this. Did they actually know that? Did they make the hulls that shape intentionally because they knew this feature, or was it just a lucky guess? There's really no way to know which, but whichever it was, it certainly did the job. There were very many clever little features on these ships. Wooden covers for the oar holes, for example. A round cover that would swing up when the oars were required and down when they weren't, secured by a locking length of wood. See, being very close to the water, if the holes were left open when not required for rowing in a heavy sea or when running with just the sail, which was done most of the time out at sea, well, water would have slopped into the ship with each wave hitting the side. The oar holes themselves, they were round with a long, thin cutout on one side. Now, this enabled the wider blade of the oar to be put through it from the inside, rather than having to lean out and pass the oar back from the outside, which, of course, would have possibly been making it very likely to simply drop the oar overboard, since Viking oars went out through the sides, not using oarlocks like fitted atop the hull, as was done on later ships. Nor were all the oars the same length, since given the very curved shape of the hull, narrowing considerably at each end, the oars near the bow and stern were longer than those amidships, so that all the oar blades would hit the water at the same time in perfect unison. Now that was a pretty clever feature. Oars were usually made of pine, and they ranged from around 17 to 19 feet in length. Now, anchors were often just a large stone set in a wooden frame, which did the job pretty well, and several of those have been discovered, though a metal anchor of the classic anchor shape has also been discovered in Denmark. Steering was done by the use of what was called a steering board, which was like a very broad oar, and it was attached to the right side of the stern as it was if you were looking forward, probably mounted on a swivel device of some kind and secured with heavy leather straps or ropes so it would pivot, and it would have been roughly there, and of course it could be moved about. This was the standard method of steering prior to the centrally mounted rudders much later on. And that is where the term starboard for the right-hand side of a ship comes from, the side that had the steer board mounted on it. The left side was known as the larboard, from Middle English larboard, meaning the side of the ship on which cargo was loaded or laded. The left-hand side, thus keeping the steering board on the right-hand side safe from damage it could get from hitting the jetty or the quayside. which was fine. But due to frequent confusion between starboard and larboard, especially with orders maybe shouted over a howling wind and a gale, it was changed to port in the 16th century. And, of course, those terms still continue today, port and starboard. The most famous feature of the Viking longship has to be the Draken, or the dragon head, fixed to the high prow. Now, this is sometimes seen as representing the great world serpent from Norse mythology, Jormungandr, the son of Loki. That, of course, was a feature of the warships only. It made them look fierce and really aggressive. Trading vessels had no need of things to frighten people. They, of course, never had anything like that fixed to their prows. While it might make raiding a lot easier, scaring the shit out of simple villagers as you sailed in and hopefully making them run away screaming wildly, and thus making a raid a lot easier, that wouldn't get you a good trading deal in the market. And perhaps you wouldn't even be let into a friendly harbour if you looked like you were going to kill things. And these heads were not, contrary to the way they are depicted in most movies and TV shows, permanent fixtures. They were removable and only fitted when required. They would never be fitted entering friendly harbours or when the ship was carrying passengers or being used for trading. An obvious sign to anyone seeing them that they were not hostile and coming in peace. And in fact, in Iceland, it was actually illegal to enter harbour with the heads fitted, for fear of frightening or angering the Landvættir, the guardian spirits of the land. Movies often show harbours full of dragon-headed ships. There are rows of them all tied up there, but that is quite incorrect. But when did Hollywood or TV companies care about historical accuracy? Let me see. Well, then there was... no, they didn't, did they? Oh well. Another famous, though actually rather doubtful, feature of Viking longships are the colourful shields hung along the sides. Now, in reality, they were probably only displayed in that manner very occasionally, perhaps entering harbour to make the ship look more impressive, for example, or just to keep the shields out of the way. There was very little open deck space, after all, on a longship, given the mast fish and all the rowing benches. But, in heavy seas, certainly in a strong storm, they would have been in danger of being swept away and lost overboard, which is why constant storage in that manner has been questioned. Now, unless there was some very secure method of attaching them, but no traces of anything like that has ever been found. Coming in on a raid with the shields displayed would have made the ship look more aggressive, I suppose, and it would have made it very easy, of course, for a man to rise from his rowing bench and grab his shield before leaping over the side. But see, here's a bit of a clue. There's a story of a man called Helbjorn who sailed into a harbour with shields decorating the sides of his ship, as it is supposed Vikings always did. Every Viking ship came in with shields along the side. But ever after, he was known as Skjoldbjorn, Shieldbjorn. So that does seem to cast some doubt on the shield idea being a common occurrence. If it were, why would they be making fun of this particular man for having shields on the side of his ship? I think that is quite a considerable clue as to the accuracy of the shields hanging along the side. Manning a longship required a reasonable level of physical fitness. After all, one would be expected to row if required, and rowing a large ship with oars 17 feet or more in length was by no means an easy matter. It took a lot more than a little rowboat with just a pair of small, short oars would, and even that is beyond some people. Pulling hard to move the ship, quickly, as on a raid, that would be a very tiring thing, and only possible for a short period, especially if you were going to get your axe and start fighting immediately after you left your rowing bench. You wouldn't want to get up going, oh God, my arm, oh the axe, oh I can't even lift the damn thing. So that would have been a bit of a disadvantage there. And even using long, slow, rhythmic strokes, as has been estimated, would not have been really viable for much more than a couple of hours. The Norse actually had exercises specially designed to improve rowing ability, and one was a sort of tug-of-war, where two men would sit facing each other, their feet touching, pulling with both hands on a rope between them. The movement similar to actual rowing, and a good way to develop the muscles required for doing it. And also probably a very good way to decide which men would make the best crew members to take on your voyage from a rowing point of view, which would be very, very important from the raiding point of view. Not so much, of course, if you were going trading. You know, Ivar and Bjorn play the game. Ivar collapses, gasping after 10 minutes, while Bjorn isn't even sweating, fresh as a daisy. So Bjorn joins the crew, and Ivar goes back to shoemaking or woodworking or whatever his day job is. There was a Norse skeleton discovered here in Dublin some years ago, and an expert from the National Museum of Ireland examined the muscle attachment points on the arms and shoulders, and she said that these showed a considerable circular movement of the arms, which obviously indicated that the man was a very experienced rower, and he would have had great arm strength. He could have punched out a horse, much like Mongo in the Blazing Saddles movie. All Norse ships were superbly built and well suited to the tasks they were designed for, but the long ships, those vessels designed primarily for raiding and war, must be seen as the pinnacle of Norse shipbuilding. They were simply perfect for the tasks they were designed for. No other ship in history was better for its intended use than the Viking longship. Fast, highly maneuverable, able to reverse direction almost instantly if it came under attack, capable of navigating up shallow rivers or beach itself due to its low draft, able to come in quickly, taking coastal or river targets by surprise, and get away again equally quickly, back out to sea before any great defence could be organised, and far too fast to be overtaken by any pursuing ships by the time they could get out. You know, they were the ideal raiders, easily outclassing larger medieval vessels that were too big and deep drafted to get in close. They would have to land their men by small boats and recover them the same way. Now, they were not warships, of course, in the way that the Greek and Roman war galleys were, mounting as they did catapults, scorpions, and Greek fire projectors, ramming each other with iron rams fixed to their bows. No, the longships' participation in actual naval combat was very limited, taking a transport role usually, and even a naval battle was not. Well, it wasn't really a naval battle as such. The ships formed floating platforms for what was really land warfare at sea, where you would lash a lot of ships together, and this would give you a nice platform to fight on, and then your men would fight as they would have on land. While boarding other longships in Norse versus Norse conflicts, of course, was easy, or against Anglo-Saxon ships, which were very similar to their own ships due to the low freeboard, they would not have attacked larger ships so easily. For the same reason, boarding them would have been very difficult due to the high side. And the men would have been very vulnerable to arrows or spears shot down at them from above. But of course, the longships were never intended for that type of action. They were not intended to be battleships like those that came later, firing at each other and all this sort of thing. And for the tasks they were intended for, they were unsurpassed by any other ship in history. Norse navigation was also excellent, using the position of the sun in daytime or the stars at night, the direction seabirds were flying when close to land, or just watching the motion of the waves could give them quite a lot of indications. Simple things like, well, for example, go to a certain town in Norway, sail west, holding a constant latitude, and you got to Iceland. Very simple. Now, they may have used a disc with a spike on it floating in a bucket of water to show latitude, using the spike's shadow cast by the sun, and this would enable them to keep a constant latitude by always keeping the shadow at the same length, which I think would have been quite a clever invention. And then there are the so-called sunstones. An Icelandic account from the 13th century, recounting a tale of the Viking times, states that the weather was thick and snowy, as Sigurdur had predicted. Then the king summoned Sigurdur and Draga to him. The king made people look out, and they could nowhere see a clear sky. Then he asked Sigurdur to tell where the sun was at that time. He gave a clear assertion. Then the king made them fetch the solar stone, and they held it up, and they saw where light radiated from the stone, and thus directly verified Sigurdur's prediction. Now these sunstones are mentioned a number of times in Icelandic literature, and also in the inventories of some churches and monasteries in the 14th and 15th century, both in Iceland and in Germany. And stones have been found that could be these sunstones, made from Icelandic spar, which is a type of crystal that had a polarizing effect, so that looking through it while moving it around could indicate where the sun might be. The thing sort of lights up. That's where the sun is, over there. In 2002, the wreck of a warship dating from the 16th century was discovered off the island of Alderney, and a stone of this type was found close to the ship's navigational instruments. And that does seem to lend credence to the saga accounts. And it also seems to indicate the effectiveness of the stone, since this one would have been used some 500 years after the end of the Viking Age. If it didn't work, well, they'd hardly still be using it after 5 centuries of achieving absolutely nothing. The Viking raids, of course, did not cease entirely in 1066, which is the official date for the end of the Viking Age, the Battle of Stamford Bridge and the death of King Harald Hardrada. There was no cut-off moment as such. It was just that with the Norman conquest of England, the increasing conversion to Christianity across Scandinavia, factors of trade and other things changing social attitudes, raiding just it gradually faded away. There were a few raids here and there for some years, and then nothing. As I say, there was no cut-off point. It just trailed away. And of course, the fearsome dragon ships never sailed again, receding into history. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I shall say farewell until next time. Goodbye for now.